We're going to look at the basics of using LLMs effectively in this video. LLMs don't think. They're generating tokens based on all the text that we've given them so far. And all that text is what's in context and forms the context window. And that context window is extremely important because what's in it determines the output that you get from the LLM. We're going to go through a simple scenario to demonstrate this. Let's say that I'm managing a project for my company. We're doing an office remodel, and as part of that office remodel, installing new audio video equipment, TVs, cameras, etc. I just found out that the project's going to be delayed, and I need to send an email to my boss. So, because AI is AI, it's just intelligent, right? So, write an email to my boss, this project's going to be delayed. And this is obviously a pretty vague prompt. I didn't really give it any direction on what this email should say. I didn't tell what my boss's name is. I didn't say anything about the project. So what I get is a pretty generic email. Hi, boss's name, giving you a heads up. This is where things stand. The delay is due to a combination of scope and some issues surfaced once we got deeper into the work. This is interesting because in reality, that's not the reason for the delay. So this is a hallucination. We gave it a very vague prompt and we did get an answer, but this is not correct. It's a coherent email and makes sense logically. It's just that the information's wrong. And what I'll see people that haven't used AI much do is say, okay, well, I need to iterate on this because they've heard that. So I'll say things like, no, that's wrong, try again, because that is an iteration, right? And the problem with that iteration is we haven't given it any better context. So LLMs are designed to do a little bit of the work here. When you chat back and forth with an LLM, you're building this context window. So this initial prompt that I put in is the context window. Its response, its original response that it gave us, that's in the context window. My next prompts and its next response, those are all in the context window. And the more things that are in that context window, the more rich it is and the more options there are for building relationships between tokens. LLMs tend to give fairly wordy responses, and the reason is because enriching a context window gives it more tokens to map relationships between. So over time, as you build that context window, you'll get better and better results. So in this case, I didn't really give it any direction or new information. The LLM was just trying to help you out there by generating some different options. So let's add some actual information here. Again, we're iterating, but there's more information here. I'm going to give it some better context saying the actual reason why it was late. Now this helps a lot because now when it generates an email, it's at least mostly correct. It's still a little weird sounding, but I want to flag a change to the project timeline so that we're tracking at least 2 weeks later. So again, this is kind of interesting because that wasn't necessarily described in the scenario specifically. It is closer to what we want, but it's not everything that we want. So we can continue to iterate on this, and let's add some more information. So one trick you can do is, why don't I just give it that email? And there's an important thing to note here for a moment. For this demo, I'm using public ChatGPT, and while I do have model training turned off, I'm about to take an email from my work context and paste it into a public ChatGPT. Generally, you shouldn't be doing that. You need to make sure you're aware of the privacy implications of what you're doing before you copy and paste work-sensitive information into public LLMs. So let's go grab our email. It's obviously a fake email, and I'm going to give it to the model. So this is the email chain that I had with a vendor. This is me, a project manager. I just wanted to confirm the deliveries. This is the things that we're looking for and the dates that we're expecting them. And then the vendor came back and said, yeah, that's fine. I emailed again after the parts that were supposed to be here already weren't. And she responds and says that she doesn't know. And then later she finds out that there's back ordered and we have a little bit of back and forth. So this is much, much richer context, and I could have replaced this in the prompt as I'm iterating by adding all this information by typing it in, but the super rich context makes it really quick and easy to generate this email to my boss. So let's look at our email now that we have this richer context. I need to flag and confirm change of the project timeline. I'll be at least 2 weeks late due to an AV vendor delivery failure. We've got the dates in here that the delivery passed, and she followed up telling me that we're back ordered and blah, blah, blah. So this is a really helpful strategy of just going through and as you're asking AI to generate things for you, understanding that it's not actually intelligent, it's making relationships between tokens and text in the context that you give it, and that's what drives the quality of the output that you're going to get. So when people talk about prompt engineering, the idea there is that instead of iterating in your initial prompt, you give it all this rich context up front. So let's see what that looks like and how we can make this faster. We're just going to start a new chat, and I'm going to add a lot more rich context right off the bat. So there's an email chain about a project delay to some back-ordered items on a project that I'm managing. I need to notify my boss and figure out what the next steps are. So let's take that same email chain, we'll put it in there. And so now we have a really long prompt. We went from, in the last example, just a sentence or two, very brief, to an explanation of what's actually going on and the context from the email. And here's our new email that we get. We can compare this to that initial one that we got of, hey, I want to flag this issue and confirm delivery dates. It passed, we escalated, they confirmed, it was back ordered, why it matters, the vendor explanation, and next steps. So that's great, but just because we have a better prompt, that doesn't mean that you still shouldn't iterate. So before we send this email to our boss explaining this, it makes sense to use AI to do some review of the email, the explanation, make sure we've thought through all the information that really needs to be in there so that when your boss gets the email, they have clear, actionable guidance on what to do. There's a few options I can think of already. We could accept the delay, not sure what the downstream effects of that would be, or how the customer is going to react. I would guess probably not very happy. We could maybe look at some alternative equipment or something else that's in stock, but I don't know if maybe we need to get an engineer to give us recommendations for that. So maybe we need to get on the phone with the engineer and the vendor too, potentially, to figure out what we can work out. Or we could look at another vendor. So let's brainstorm. So far, I've given the LLM information, but we can also get the LLM to give us information. So let's brainstorm what the possible options are for solving this issue, because I don't necessarily want to just send my boss an email saying there's an issue and I don't know what to do about it. What I want to do is send my boss an email with an issue explaining clearly what it was, how it was caused, and how we should respond. So let's take a look at that. The first thing you'll notice is that ChatGPT has to tell you about how you're thinking so right and you're so awesome. And then it's going to, again, look at some issues. Now, these are suggestions. Keep this in mind. They're coming from the LLM, so they're very coherent and they're frequently right, but they're not always right. So engage your brain while you're doing this. We need to see, how does this really affect the schedule? What is the technical risk here? How does this change management process? What do we need to do with that? How is the client going to react to this? And how does it affect the finances? So here's one option, right? We could just accept the delay. We have to wait a couple weeks. It's going to cause some issues, but maybe that makes sense. We could substitute equipment from the current vendor, so that's fine, but we probably need to get on a call with engineering. We can do a hybrid approach where we do substitution for the delayed components and then swap them out later. That seems expensive, but I guess it's an option. We could look at another vendor to get those same components from, or we could escalate it, above my contact at the vendor. So those are some different options, but which options do we really want to follow? And there's a couple ways you could do this. One is you can let the LLM guide you through this. You can say things like, what's your suggestion? And that can be really dangerous because AI gives you coherent responses, but it's not necessarily thinking. So really it's better to guide it. Instead of saying, I don't know, what do you think? Which makes no sense because the thing you're talking to doesn't think. Let's say, give me the pros and cons for those options and compare them in a concise way. So there was a lot to read again. The reason it's a lot to read is because LLMs like to generate a lot of text because it's richer context to generate from. So let's pare this down. This is a little better. Here's some options. The same ones that we looked at. Here's the pros and cons, the risk. I kind of like this because I can give this table to my boss and they can read it quickly and make a decision, but it is still a little wordy. So I can do things like make that table more concise, and it'll take a stab at it. It will generate a more concise table, but it's not necessarily the best way to do it. It's really better to declare your intention and say what you want. So I like that table. Let's say I like that table, but there's too much info in here. List the pros and cons more concisely. So I can give very specific direction. I can say things like remove the what it is column, or only use one bullet for pros and cons, or make them shorter. I can also just give it general guidance. I don't necessarily have to be super detailed about every single change that I want to make. Although when you do that, you get better results because you specified where it is that you want and you clarified your intent. However, you can be a little bit more vague. So for instance, here's a pared down table. This looks a lot better. All right, so here's our options. Here's our pros and cons. Here's the schedule impact and the risk. So that's great. Here's one thing that working with AIs that's sometimes frustrating to deal with is these options aren't very clear. So because they're not clear, let's fix that. So interesting, I was kind of vague about it. For one thing, there's a typo. I really needed to say that wasn't very clear and put them in plain English. And two, it did exactly what I told it to do. It took the data out of the table and put it into English, plain English text. So I've clarified my intent. Again, this is iteration. You don't need to feel like just because you got to a certain point and it's messed up and you have a problem now that you need to completely start over. you have the context of all these chats. So you can say, hey, I want to refer back to this earlier thing, and it'll be able to make that association. Okay, so here's our new table, and this looks a lot better. So let's work that table into the email and give me a version recommending that we go with the second option. I'll get a call together with an engineer, but I need to know which engineer I should pull in. So this is a much, much better email. It addresses the intent, which is I need to explain this project delay to my boss, and I need to resolve it in one of several different ways. And right now I could probably send this email to my boss. It would be fine. There's some specific things that you probably notice as you go through this, and it's up to you how much you want to clean it up. So for instance, I could tell the model what my boss's name is, and then I can regenerate it with their name. I could also just edit it before sending the email. And there's a lot of extraneous language in here, and the reason it builds all this is because of the context in the context window. As the LLM's generating tokens, it's making relationships with previous tokens, and so it inserts things that aren't strictly necessary, but were contextually sensitive in this conversation. So just as an example, this phrase as context isn't really necessary. This could just say some training room, AV components. Again, are now confirmed to be backordered by approximately 2 weeks. We could just say that they're backordered by at least 2 weeks. Is committed really necessary? So we can change this language, and there's a couple ways to do it. One is you can argue with the LLM and say as context isn't really necessary, now confirmed to be backordered, has extraneous phrasing. So you can put those things, that feedback, into your prompt, and you can instruct the LLM that this is not the type of output I want. And as you're doing that, you're adding more context to the window, and the LLM will use it to achieve a better result. However, that can sometimes be really frustrating. And a lot of the times when you're working with AI, what you really want to do is just get it to 90% and then hand edit it from there. So it's up to you. It depends on how far away this is from your desired state. But at some point, just taking the output from AI and doing a quick manual editing step is usually the more efficient approach. There's also some additional interesting things you can do here. You can use AI to bounce ideas off of instead of converging on a solution too early. You can say, my boss has 30 years of experience in this type of work, and he's been in the company forever, and he likes this vendor, but this is the third issue with them. And what questions is he likely to ask me? What types of reactions should I be prepared for? I think he's probably going to be mad. So what we're doing here is we're giving some meta context about the boss specifically, because it's important to consider that what you're doing when you're writing an email is you're not writing an email, you're communicating some information to a person. This is simulated because the LLM obviously doesn't know my boss. He doesn't even know his name, and just a little tiny bit of information. But let's break this into parts. This is going to be coherent, but not necessarily correct. So again, critical thinking is important. So what's probably going off in his head is he's saying, oh, this isn't a one-time thing anymore. Also, this is a long-term relationship, and maybe this reflects poorly on him. He's frustrated with the process. He's trying to be protective and make sure that the client's taken care of. And the questions he's really wanting to ask are probably, how did we not know this answer earlier? We do have an answer for that, actually. Is the vendor story reliable? Should I still be working with this vendor? So he's probably thinking through that. What's the worst case if we don't do anything? He's thinking about that. Why are we considering changing the equipment, and what would that affect? And why haven't we brought the client into this yet? So have they been notified? Well, based on that email, he doesn't know if the client's been notified. Which option would you pick? Well, we did give him an option and some likely reactions and some things that we can do. So that's great. Let's think through that and then give the model some additional context. So the client doesn't know yet. We'll make some additions to the email based on our boss's likely point of view and the questions that he's likely to ask. So again, ChatGPT tells you how smart you are, what a great question you asked. And then it suggests that we do say the client hasn't been notified yet, but I want to make sure that we know what we're doing. So when we communicate, we give solutions instead of just a problem. We should probably add that this is the third issue with the vendor. Strengthen the recommendation so it sounds a little bit more decisive. Add a sentence that reassures them that you're not letting the vendor off the hook. So make the engineer question even easier to answer. I could suggest 2 different people, but that also narrows the field, and I feel like it's my boss's job to tell me which engineer, so I'm just going to let him do that. And a quiet reassurance about the next step with the clients again. ChatGPT loves to use quiet all the time, but generally I think this is fine. So give me the full email draft. All right, so let's read through this. It looks like we've added this stuff that's additional context. We've got these different options. Here's my recommendation. This is what I need to do, which engineer. See, I told it to do that, and that's not really what I wanted, but I think this is fine. This is close enough to what I want. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to hand edit it for correctness, and then I'm going to send it off to my boss. And sometimes what I'll do after I do the hand correction is I'll put it back into the LLM to double check for clarity, quality, spelling, punctuation, flow, things like that. But that really just depends on how comfortable you are with your own writing and how much you're editing it. So I hope this was helpful. Again, keep in mind that LLMs work because you give them information to work with. They're not actually in and of themselves intelligent, and they can't read your mind. If you don't give them information to work with, they are not going to work well.